Have you ever witnessed someone being slapped in front of hundreds and no one dared to speak up? Sophie Hartley stepped into Ellington Hall, where every marble tile beneath her feet had once witnessed billion-dollar negotiations. But tonight, that room wasn't for talks of contracts or profits. It existed solely to drown a single human being in icy stares and venomous whispers. The white dress she wore had no label. It cost $20 bought from a discount shop on the corner. The shoes on her feet were scuffed, mud-stained, and smeared with horse manure from a Napa farm. No makeup, no designer brands, no excuses, only a calm gaze that made the entire room uncomfortable. The soft sound of violins played in the background. Then silence fell when Charles Hartley, the man who had once adopted her, stepped into the center of the room. No one stopped him. No one spoke. And then he slapped her. Hard, cold, without reason. The crack of the slap echoed off the high ceiling like a bell of disgrace. No one was shocked. No one protested, because they had all been waiting for this moment. Olivia, the pampered foster sister, groomed like a princess, shed perfect tears and spoke as if truly heartbroken. "You shouldn't have come here. You don't belong in this world." Blake Monroe, Olivia's CEO boyfriend, hailed by the press as the next Wall Street prodigy, looked Sophie up and down, smirked, and said loud enough for all to hear, "Real aristocrats don't muck stables. You should know your place." An older woman seated in the back lifted her champagne glass, her eyes sharp as a blade. "That girl was once locked outside with the horses. There's no place for her kind in this house." And then came the laughter. At first, just a few scattered giggles, but it spread quickly like wildfire across dry grass, soft, but sharp enough to shred the fragile skin of dignity. Sophie stood still, her cheek flushed from the slap, but she didn't bow her head. She didn't cry. She didn't talk back. Her hands remained folded in front of her, the composed posture of someone who has nothing left to lose, but also the stance of someone who knows she carries something none of them ever will. Silence. And it was that very silence that would one day bring this entire room to its knees. They just didn't know it yet. Ellington Hall was so vast that every footstep echoed twice before reaching the walls. The ceiling soared nearly 8 meters high, adorned with 4 massive Swarovski chandeliers, casting a cold glow onto walnut chairs, each hand-carved and worth as much as a year's tuition at Stanford. On every chair sat a name, and every name belonged to a shareholder, a banker, a politician, someone who had mastered the art of smiling while stabbing others in the back. They were not here to mourn Richard Ellington. They came for the name he left behind, the seat everyone assumed Olivia would claim. The legacy was worth billions, none of which they believed would ever fall into the hands of a girl who once shoveled horse manure. Olivia Hartley sat at the center of the front row. A black dress hugged her frame, modest enough to preserve decorum, revealing enough to assert dominance. Soft blonde curls, flawless skin, a half smile. If there was anything artificial about her face, it was her eyes. In them, there was nothing but calculation. Beside her sat Blake Monroe, once featured on the cover of Forbes under the headline "Wall Street Prodigy" at 29. The Richard Mille watch on his wrist could pay the annual salary of the entire mid-level staff at the company. But the sharpest thing about Blake was the cutting glance he shot at Sophie, as if her mere presence in the same room was an insult. To the left sat Susan and Charles Hartley, Sophie's adoptive parents' backs, straight chins, high hands clasped together like they were posing for a finance magazine. Susan's pearl necklace glinted under the chandelier like a slash. Charles's Patek Philippe flashed every time he clenched his fist. They looked at Sophie, like she was a speck of dirt that had blown onto the red carpet in the middle of a high society gala. And then there were the others, relatives, partners, legal advisors. Women in Chanel speak through narrowed glances, men in Italian shoes, crossing their legs and sneering with faint smiles, each playing their role. And the one shared role across the room was this: no one believed Sophie belonged. Yet she sat there, in silence, in a room more expensive than any of their convictions. Not a single one of them knew that the quiet girl, sitting in the far corner of that opulent room, was the only person who had wiped Richard Ellington's brow as he convulsed, the only one who fed him soup and injected his insulin every night for the last 6 months of his life. She didn't need to speak in her defense, because this room didn't understand the truth. It only understood power. And Sophie knew, very soon, truth would be the final slap they never saw coming. No one in that gilded room knew, or rather no one wanted to speak, of the unforgivable mistake made years ago at a public hospital on the outskirts of Napa. A child born into the Ellington family had been mistakenly handed to a single mother working at a horse ranch. Meanwhile, her daughter Olivia was wrapped in velvet blankets and placed straight into the back of a billionaire family's SUV. Sophie grew up amid the scent of hay, her back aching from hauling water, her hands calloused from mucking out stables. At the age of 12, the truth came out. She was brought into the Ellington household, but no one embraced her and no one called her daughter. They placed her in a small room, at the end of the hall, a space that had once been a storage closet. They taught her how to walk, how to speak, how to use cutlery, but no one ever taught her how to be loved. Olivia remained exactly where she was, still the daughter, still the center of every gathering, still the chosen heir. And Sophie, she was called a responsibility, a legal obligation, someone they couldn't deny but never truly wanted to acknowledge. She couldn't keep up with Olivia in school. She didn't understand the jokes of the privileged kids. When she once called a senior executive Mr. instead of Sir Susan sent her to polish wine glasses in the kitchen. When she accidentally spilled red wine on the documents of an Arab partner at a business gala, the whole family screamed at her. No one asked why those papers had been placed so close to the glass Olivia had just set down. They said Sophie had ruined a billion-dollar deal. They needed no proof, just a name to pin the blame on. And that name was always hers. From that day on, they no longer called her Sophie. They called her with glances, with silence, with phrases like, "that girl," "the one from the ranch," or worse, the disgrace with the correct birth certificate. And yet through all those years, Sophie stayed. Not for money, not for inheritance, but for one reason only: Richard Ellington. He was the only one who saw her beyond the clothes she wore, the one who placed a hand on her shoulder when others pulled away, the one who asked if she had eaten while the rest of the family treated her as invisible. When he had a stroke, she was the only one who dared touch him. When he was bedridden, she was the only one who entered his room. Not a single soul in that gold-plated hall knew that while they sipped wine and toasted Olivia's name at glamorous dinners, Sophie was in the shadows, cleaning a trembling old man, feeding him spoonfuls of porridge, measuring every drop of medicine, guarding every heartbeat. That is why she sits here today, not for the fortune, but for the truth. And truth, unlike their gold, doesn't need to be polished to silence an entire room. The air in the room turned cold, not because of the air conditioning, but because of human intent. One glance was enough to trigger a storm of whispers. One crooked smile was all it took to launch a courtroom drama without a single lawyer. Sophie had barely sat down, hadn't even adjusted her dress, when a female voice rang out from behind her. Sharp, bitter, unapologetic. That girl's still breathing after losing a $1 billion deal. I thought they shipped her back to the ranch. A man in front turned around loud enough for the entire hall to hear. She's actually sitting in here, in that tissue-thin excuse for a dress. What an embarrassment to Ellington. Soft laughter followed, spreading like a contagion. Blake Monroe nodded, his voice calm, as if discussing quarterly figures. What is she even doing here? Auditioning for the dictionary definition of low class. A young cousin to the left lifted her head. I heard she wears discount clothes and second-hand shoes. That dress probably pulled from a $3 a kilo bin. Susan Hartley pursed her lips, turned to Charles, and whispered just loud enough for Sophie to hear. We should have never let her walk in through the front door. Charles nodded, his gaze fixed not on Sophie, but on the seat he believed belonged to Olivia. She's only here for attention. Sooner or later, her real face will show. And like a toxic symphony, the voices began to merge into a chorus. The girl from the stables. The fake heiress. The shadow that doesn't know its place. The one who thought caring for Richard would earn her a fortune. Each word stabbed at Sophie's dignity. Each laugh sliced another thread of pride. And yet, she remained seated. Her eyes are unflinching. Her hands are steady. No one knew if her heart was racing. But her face was calm. Composed, so still, it strangely made all the insults lose momentum. Olivia escalated the drama. Her voice trembled, as if holding back tears. Sweetheart, we don't need to do this. This isn't a livestock auction. This is Ellington. You understand that, right? Sophie turned her head, but said nothing. Blake cut in arms. Folded Olivia's little sister used to shovel horse crap. And now she thinks she belongs at a boardroom table. Nobility like that only exists in bad daytime TV. And just when the room thought they had wrung out every last ounce of humiliation, Charles stood. Again. His voice slammed through the hall like a judge's gavel. I raised her. But I never called her daughter, because someone who spent 12 years in a stable can never be a Hartley. She was a responsibility, a name I was forced to accept. Still, Sophie did not cry, but her cheek burned not from shame, but from the blatant distortion of truth in front of hundreds of witnesses. She knew they weren't trying to hurt her. They were trying to elevate themselves, to push her down, to protect a lie they had all invested their lives in. They thought she came here to fight for the inheritance. They had no idea she only came for one truth, a truth none of them had the courage to face. And just as the laughter reached its peak, just as Charles turned his back with victory on his lips, a voice echoed through the room. And it wasn't Sophie's. It was the voice of someone everyone believed was already dead. No one noticed the gray-haired man standing at the front. No one paid attention to the sound of parchment being pulled from a thick envelope sealed with red wax. The room was still preoccupied with mockery and contemptuous glances aimed at a girl in a $20 white dress. But then, the voice of attorney James Calloway rang out. No microphone, no need to raise it, just firm enough. As the legal executor and final witness to Mr. Richard Ellington, I request permission to read the official last will and testament signed, certified, and notarized on June 12th of this year at his private office in the Ellington estate. The room slowed a beat. Olivia tilted her head slightly. Blake squinted. Charles folded his arms. Susan adjusted her pearl necklace as if preparing to receive good news she already believed was hers. I, Richard Ellington, in sound mind and full legal capacity and under no coercion, hereby declare this my final will and testament. I will not divide my estate equally. I will not allocate by percentage. I will not distribute by social rank. I leave everything, all of my estate, including Ellington Holdings, all domestic and international properties, shares, managerial rights, art collections, digital assets, commercial real estate yachts, private jet usage rights, and all intellectual properties, in my name, shall be granted to one individual. One person who holds no title in gossip. One who was once called the girl from the stables. The only person I believe to be my true family. Everything shall go to Sophie Hartley. The whispers died instantly. The crowded room suddenly felt airless. Someone dropped a champagne glass, but no one bent to pick it up. Olivia gripped Blake's arm, her face pale, but lips tight to maintain composure. Susan's eyes widened. Charles sat motionless, like a stone statue. "This can't be," Olivia whispered, almost soundless. "This can't be real." A board member shot to his feet. "This is a joke, right? She once lost us a major contract," a woman from the back chimed in. "She has no education. How could she possibly run this empire?" An older man pulled out a handkerchief, gasping, "She's no one, just a name tacked on out of legal obligation." The room erupted into chaos. Some shouted, some sneered, some made phone calls, others hissed threats in hushed tones. And Sophie. She sat there, her hands folded neatly on her white dress. Her eyes never left the lawyer's face. No shock, no joy, just calm. As if she had known all along. Blake stood, half leaning on the conference table. She must have coerced him into signing it when he was too ill to think clearly. He wasn't in his right mind. She manipulated him, pretended to care, earned his trust, just to exploit it. A woman in a red suit shouted, her gaze ablaze. Olivia began crying again, but this time there were no tears, only confusion. "I loved you like a sister. But this is betrayal, Sophie." Charles slammed his hand on the table. "I won't accept this. I'll sue. I'll have this annulled, no matter what it takes." But just as they were about to raise their voices again, the sound of a door opening echoed through the hall. A solid, deliberate thud. The grand entrance was pushed wide open, and what stepped through made every mouth clamp shut, as if the room had been choked into silence. A wooden cane tapped rhythmically against the marble floor. A tall, thinner figure, eyes still sharp as ever. Richard Ellington walked in. The sound of the cane striking the marble floor froze the entire room. Richard Ellington entered. Thinner, paler, but his eyes still sharp, just as they were when he ruled California's largest financial empire. He looked straight at Charles. "You just slapped the rightful heir to my legacy, but it wasn't her. You slapped me. That was a blow to my decision." His gaze shifted to Olivia. "You poured wine on a partner's documents and blamed it on your sister causing me to lose $1 billion contract." Then to Blake, "You call yourself a leader while Sophie fed me soup every night, and you attended parties talking about power. She never once asked me for anything. And that's exactly why I gave her everything. She doesn't need to share my blood to be worthy. She has something none of you do, character. From this moment on, anyone who still objects to her has 48 hours to leave this house." And Sophie, he turned to her at last, voice steady and full of meaning. "You don't owe a single soul in this room any explanation." The room was suffocatingly silent. No one dared to meet Richard's eyes, nor Sophie's. Olivia stood, her head bowed low, tears no longer falling, replaced by hollow panic. Blake quietly slipped off his watch and tucked it into his pocket, fully aware that the power he once flaunted now meant nothing. Charles and Susan said nothing. They simply walked out of Ellington Hall, bearing the posture of people who had lost everything without even understanding how. The board members who once nodded in agreement with Olivia now silently gathered their documents, eyes averted. One of them muttered under his breath, "We backed the wrong person." And while everyone busied themselves with retreating in shame, Sophie remained seated in the front row, calm, composed, needing no words, no movement, no shouting victory, because she had already won through kindness. Richard spoke one final sentence, low, steady, but every word rang clear. From this day forward, Ellington is no longer a legacy of deceit. It is the future of loyalty, and Sophie will be the one to lead it. Sophie stepped up the three-tiered platform leading to the executive chair, the very seat she'd been told her whole life never to touch. She didn't glance to the right, where Olivia once sat pulling strings behind a painted smile. She didn't look left, where Charles and Susan used to command with silent glares. She simply placed her hand on the walnut armrest, sat down, spine straight, chin held high, without saying a word. There was no applause, yet the entire room held its breath. The once mocked white dress was now a symbol. The scuffed old shoes now stood on marble like they'd always belonged there. The same people who once called her trash were now signing resignation letters. Those who once judged her for growing up in a stable were now printing apology letters in the company bulletin. Richard stood behind her. He didn't need to speak. He simply placed a hand on her shoulder, his final affirmation. And in that moment, every prejudice ever tied to the name Sophie Hartley shattered. She was once the shame of this estate. Now she was the reason it would endure another generation. This story isn't just an epic twist among the elite. It's a reminder for all of us. Honor isn't printed on a birth certificate, it's written in how you live when no one's watching. Sophie never had to scream for justice. She stayed silent, and that silence made the entire world bow. If you've ever been underestimated because of your background, ever been mocked for not being flashy enough, remember this. Sometimes the ones they dismiss the most are the ones destined to lead. What do you think about Sophie's silence? Was it weakness or strength? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Toch Story, so you never miss another powerful tale like this one.